Does the Constitution require a unitary executive in control of all things apportioned to the executive branch? John Yoo says yes. George Will says no. The unitary executive theory, coming up on Conservative Crossroads now. Welcome back to Conservative Crossroads, the program where conservatives lean into their differences rather than deny them. I'm Henry Olson, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy, and your host and moderator for these programs. Today, the subject is the unitary executive theory. Does the president have the sole and unitary authority to wield all tasks assigned to the executive branch by the Constitution? Here to talk about this important topic are two excellent scholars and thinkers, John Yoo, perhaps the man who's most known for creating or reviving this theory, and George Will, perhaps our nation's most eminent political thinker and columnist for many decades. We will begin as is normal in this program. Each person will have 5 minutes to present their viewpoints. We will then have 40 minutes of mutual questioning, and then we'll reverse the order with 2 minutes for concluding statements. As the progenitor of this theory, John, you're up.
Thanks, Henry. First, let me say, I am not the progenitor of this theory. I am a mere handmaiden to Alexander Hamilton, who is the true author of the unitary executive theory. But let me say it's a great pleasure to be with you, Henry. We've worked together for many years. And then it's a real honor to be on this podcast with George Will. I find with Mr. Will, I usually agree with 99% of what he writes. Strangely, we disagree over the two Ps, the two most important Ps, the presidency and the Philadelphia Phillies. I don't understand why he doesn't appreciate seasons and seasons of losing. That's part of what it means to be a Philadelphian, which is where I grew up. So the unitary executive theory, I think, when Alexander Hamilton sets it out, I think it's just a straightforward textual theory, which is why I think it also appealed to the great Justice Antonin Scalia, who set the theory out also in his dissent in Morrison versus Olson, and eventually has won the day, I would say, at least for now, in the Supreme Court, which just issued a case called Trump versus Slaughter, where I think it fully embraced the unitary executive theory. And it briefly stated, it's this: the Constitution grants all executive power in the federal government to the president. One of those duties that the president also has is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He's the only official in the Constitution who is given that responsibility. It is, in fact, I think the essence of the executive power is twofold: to take care the laws are faithfully executed and to protect the nation's security. And so in order to fulfill those duties, the president has to be able to command subordinate executive officials, anyone who assists him or her in carrying out federal law. Because, and this is the interesting lacuna in the Constitution doesn't actually require any lower executive branch official to obey the president. So you could have had a government that is somewhat like the New Deal Constitution created by FDR in the Congress, where you have all these agency heads running around executing the law as they see fit without any kind of central unifying force. In our system, that's the president. But if the president can't order them to carry out the duty of carrying out federal law, how does he fulfill his ultimate constitutional duty? And so the Supreme Court has said, Alexander Hamilton has said, it must be through the power to remove. The power to remove lower executive branch officials is the way that the president creates a unified policy and carries it out, which allows him to fulfill his constitutional duties. Now, the executive power is not just the power to run the human resources department. The president is not the HR officer of the executive branch. A lot of, I think, what the dispute amongst conservatives involves is there any substance as well? And this, the Supreme Court has not touched as much. Does Article 2's grant of, quote unquote, the executive power to the president convey, for example, unenumerated authorities in the Constitution. This also was the issue that confronted Alexander Hamilton right at the beginning of the Constitution. The French Revolution actually called on the United States to decide how would we interpret the treaties with France? Who gets to set foreign policy? Again, an interesting lacuna in the Constitution. The Constitution does not say who sets foreign policy on behalf of the country. Alexander Hamilton says, and I think this is the logic we've repeated ever since, the executive power has always included the power to set foreign policy. Therefore, when the Constitution makes that grant to the president, it implicitly granted the president the right to decide, are we going to be friendly towards Iran? Or are we going to be hostile to Iran? George Washington adopted Hamilton's theory, which are set out in what they're called the Helvidius Pacificus debates. And that's been the lesson of our history ever since. We've always assumed presidents set foreign policy ever since then. Lastly, the unitary executive theory, which I think has really been upheld by the court now, is to stop Congress from trying to create independent power centers within the executive branch. The president has to be able to use the removal power to control them and use this substantive authority in the executive power clause to be able to govern them and have them all act cooperatively in achieving a unified executive agenda.
Thank you, John. George, you're up.
All the things that Alexander Hamilton said that John has just quoted were said at the time when the first Congress was meeting, essentially. The first Congress of the United States had more members, with 13 states, remember. They had more members than did the entire federal bureaucracy at that time. So if we're going to be originalists here, we ought to take seriously what the original situation of the federal government was. I think the unitary executive theory, which I supported until I started thinking about it, I was for overturning the Humphreys executor until I read more about it. It seems to me the unitary executive theory scratches what I would call humanity's Rosetta Stone itch. That is the desire to find something that decodes everything and answers all questions. The unitary executive advocates begin with a sentence from Scalia in a dissent saying all executive power is vested in the president. And so many of the advocates of the unitary executive theory seem to think the argument ends there. That's actually where the argument begins. Let's accept the terms that Scalia pronounced, but then wonder what is an executive power. In her dissent from the ruling overturning Humphrey's executor, Justice Kagan said, look, we have all these organizations now, entities, independent commissions, whatever you want to call them, that exercise essentially legislative powers. They define certain offenses. They lead to the punishment of certain offenses. That sounds awfully legislative. And indeed, Justice Gorsuch, in his concurrence with the ruling overturning Humphrey's executors, said we really ought to begin to take seriously the non-delegation doctrine because we have delegated vast legislative powers to these agencies. So my primary concern here is that we're assuming an artificial clarity. We are injudiciously assuming an artificial clarity as to what is and is not executive power. I agree with John. We have to go back to the origins of our country as good originalists. But we have to understand we have not just originalism in constitutional construction. We have an originalist political culture in our country because, unlike most nations, we had a clear origin. We know when it was and what it was and why it was, and we were very articulate about all of those things in July 1776. Because we have an originalist political culture, we ought to take seriously the consequences. When people say the the founders and framers of our Constitution had wanted to protect the presidency. It seems to me that we have to understand that these are the very same people who originally produced the Electoral College as they thought it was going to function. That is, it was going to not have a president in a sort of a Jacksonian manner accountable to and embodying the spirit of the people, but they went out of their way to produce in the Electoral College, as originally conceived, a system that would insulate the president from being accountable to the people. They produced through that Electoral College a president at severe remove from the popular passions and the popular accountability that the unitary executive theory wants to embody. It seems to me that one question that John and I ought to talk about is, should we worry about the consequences of a particular theory, unitary executive theory, if it is occurring at a time of rampant presidentialism, at a moment of presidential supremacy of the sort never envisioned by and presumably would have horrified the originalists, the framers of the Constitution.
Thank you, George. Well, the floor is yours, gentlemen. Who wants to begin the discussion?
Why don't I start by asking George a question? Because I think I agree completely, which I think was his first point, but not explicitly stated. But it goes to his ending comment about how do we, as a good originalist, apply, it seems to me your question is, how do we apply the original understanding, which was to have a separation of powers, 3 clear branches. We may disagree about which powers exactly fit into the 3 branches, but a separation of powers with 3 branches, not a parliamentary system. How do we apply that to circumstances today, which the founders may not have foreseen? It seems to me, yes, we live in an area of great presidential power, which the founders may not have anticipated. But also seems to me there's an even greater blemish on the constitutional structure, which I think is really how George started, which is the administrative state, which is progressivism, the progressive government, authored by Teddy Roosevelt, by Woodrow Wilson. And so that, I think, is, if you took the founders and brought them today, I think that would be thunder. As you said, George, the Congress was larger than the executive branch at the time of the founding. So if that's the real problem, that was created by 3 changes. And the progressives were so open about this. They wanted to have independence from political control for the agencies. Number 2, they wanted complete delegation of authority from Congress to the agencies. And then 3, unlimited federal power over the economy and society. Here's the question. Sorry for being so long. Why is it the unitary executive, the power to remove, the beginning of an answer to that? If you think about it, it knocks out the first leg of that 3-part stool that the progressives wanted. With a unitary executive controlling removal, you've knocked out this idea that agencies should be filled with experts who are completely independent from political control. At least now they're under the control of the president.
In theory, it's a pretty tenuous connection we have if we're saying the American people, following as they do the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Trade Commission and all, either applaud or get angry about what they do, and they apply that approval or anger to up the chain of command to the president. That's not, it seems to me, a realistic description of how things work. Here's the real problem. St. James Madison, who I revere above all the others, famously and mistakenly said that in a republic, all power gets sucked into the impetuous vortex of the legislative branch. Turns out what we now know centuries on is that the legislature in the modern functioning or malfunctioning of the Madisonian system, is busy spinning off powers, spinning off responsibility and accountability. We know that. And it would be nice to have, and I'd like to hear John on this, some revival of and strengthening of the non-delegation doctrine, where the Supreme Court would say to Congress, we can't do that. This court has been very good about that. It seems to me that it's overturning what was left of Chevron deference, revitalizing and creating and revitalizing the major questions doctrine, are all ways that the court has been saying to Congress, please come back and get involved in governance. We all know that what Congress does nowadays is not so much pass laws as pass sentiments, or as Chris Demuth says, that what they call legislation are really velities. They just say, we hereby legislate that all Americans should have a quality education. And you fellows down at the base of Capitol Hill in the education department, you fill in the details. And we'll more or less monitor what you say. But we all know they don't monitor what they say because they're too busy trying to cross North Capitol Street to get on television. So the Madisonian system is not working at all as Madison intended or anticipated, partly because in 1790, the founders neither desired nor anticipated a party system. By 1800, we had a robust party system and have ever since. And Congress has more or less, in acquiescing to the rise of the presidency, has said that the president's members of the president's party in the Congress are downfield blockers for his quarterbacking. So the whole Madisonian assumption of a rivalrous relationship between the executive and the legislative branches has been obviated by the rise of the party system. So I guess what I want John to talk about is, since no one anticipated anything remotely like a Jacksonian presidency, let alone the one we have far advanced from now, the seventh president, how helpful is it for us to say, as originalists, we want the presidency to be so powerful, and we want Congress to be forbidden to create independent agencies and stipulate as the assumption, as part of the bargain in creating them, that Congress shall have retained power over their composition.
I completely agree with George that Madison's vision of the separation of powers has failed. We're in a kind of post-Madisonian republic. And that the Madisonian vision, I agree, was that you would create these three branches, and that Madison's classic phrase, ambition will counteract ambition, and that constant fighting and pursuit of power between the three branches would keep them in check. It's a sort of Newtonian physics of the spheres balancing each other. And I also agree with your second point, George, that the reason that has failed is not necessarily because the president failed. In fact, the president is in a way living up to the Madisonian vision of constantly trying to expand its power. It's because Congress, I think you're right, shockingly would have been to Madison, did not turn out to be the vortex of power. Congress now, as you say, actually wants to deny its responsibilities. The progressive vision of government encouraged this by saying you should delegate all your authority. But I agree, Mr. Will, that there's a political incentive which the founders didn't anticipate, which is that members of Congress running for re-election don't want to take controversial votes. And so the best way to get out of that is to make the administrators have to make those choices behind the veil of alleged expertise. But so the question is, what would be the solution? So one is, I agree with you. I think if you think of what the court's doing, what conservatives are doing is they're going in stages. The first stage was to restore some kind of political control over the agencies so they're not independent. I agree with you. The second step is now, is the court going to reinvigorate the non-delegation doctrine, say there are limits on how important the decisions are that Congress can transfer over to the agencies. As you said, Justice Gorsuch has been on this. Justice Thomas, who I clerked for, has been on this for a long time. And I count 5 or maybe 6 votes on the Supreme Court for reinvigorating the non-delegation doctrine, which used to exist until the New Deal, until FDR tried to pack the court, and the court gave in to the New Deal and gave in on the non-delegation doctrine. The justices can't agree on the test, which is strange because they're all professional lawyers. One thing lawyers like me and Henry can do is make up tests. They don't even have to do with the principles. We can just make up any kind of test you want. They can't agree on it, but they do agree on that. And then, so I think that will be part of the agenda. And I think that will go a long way towards solving this problem. And then I think the third step will be saying there are real limits to the Commerce Clause. There's real limits on the spending power. But I think to successfully handle the administrative state, you have to do all 3. Now, one problem, and I would ask George this, is having worked in Congress, I'm not sure Congress would bear the responsibility, even if it was forced on them. So imagine a non-delegation doctrine world where the court says, no, if the country is going to be governed by, say, a minimum miles per gallon for cars, will Congress still really pass that law, or will they try to figure out other ways to get someone else to decide it for them? Look at the tariff cases going on right now. President Trump just reimposed tariffs yesterday after the Supreme Court struck down the first round of tariffs, which I agreed with the court on that. Do you think Congress is going to, did they, in this intervening period, pass any laws about tariffs? No. Are they going to pass any law with regard to Trump's new tariffs? I predict no again, even though I think they're quite economically damaging and don't really make a lot of sense. So that's one problem with the Madisonian system is even if you restored powers to Congress, they have a very strong political incentive not to use them. And so the question is, why should we put limits on the presidency, which I don't think are in the original understanding, in order to make up for Congress' deficiencies? That's one. And then the second question is that requires you to have in your mind a sense of what the right balance is between the Congress and the president. And so essentially, I think what I read George is saying is, well, Congress has come out of balance, so we are going to decrease presidential power to restore a balance. But this is a problem Justice Scalia had with Morrison versus Oldham, with the independent counsel. They had with Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor-esque balancing is, how do judges know what the right balance is? Like, what do you know what the balance is? How do we tell what the right balance is? Their view, and I think this was the idea between the Unitary Executive and Hamilton, was that we don't want courts actually sitting in and thinking, should the president versus Congress have a certain fine balance over the control of foreign relations? We expect the branches to fight it out. If Congress isn't going to use its powers and the president's going to expand them, there's really nothing the courts can do about it. It's ultimately up to the American people through elections or maybe Congress through impeachment.
Yeah, in my long life of serial futilities, I have enough lost causes to know one when I see one. And I know that the revival of Congress is probably one of those. Because, as John says, using the key Madison word, incentives, all the incentives with which Madison was nimble and focused, all the incentives nowadays are for them to go about doing what they've been doing for 90 years now, which is spin-off power. I got that, and it's very hard to reverse. But let me ask you a question, John, because I don't know the answer to this. When Congress started creating independent agencies in the 19th century with the Interstate Commerce Commission and the FTC and the SEC and all the rest, would they have created those if they had known that what the bargain they thought they were striking, which was they could set terms for the exercise of their power, would they? Are we essentially changing the game, the rules of the game, and should we go back and give Congress a do-over? to say, well, look, if we knew we weren't going to have this removal power, or if the president was going to have it, we wouldn't have done this.
I think that's a great point. And this is the legal question of severability, which I think the court has overused in order to escape making hard choices like the one you're setting out. I agree. If it seems to me, if the Supreme Court is going to say, for example, as it did, the head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, one of the most powerful agencies over the financial system in the federal government, controlled by one person who can't be fired by the president. If the court's going to say that's unconstitutional, personally, I would say the court should say the whole agency is unconstitutional.
Of course it is.
And then have Congress, instead of saying, no, we'll let you have the delegation, the other stools of the other feet of the stool. We're going to let you have the huge delegation. We're going to let you have unbounded power over consumer finance and preempt the states. But we're going to let you have the president have direct control over that agency. I agree with you. I think if Congress were to rethink it, they would probably then not create those agencies, perhaps not give them as much power. Congress has always tried all these techniques, which the court now has been striking down. You might remember this is like the legislative veto, where Congress said, we'll give you all these great powers to the agencies and the president. And when you use them, we still want to let one committee override your verdict, as it were. And the Supreme Court struck that down in a case called Chadha. And I think that's the best the court can do. And maybe we ask too much of the courts in all this, is they can, I think, monitor the bright lines, like this is executive, this is legislative, and they can strike down weird creations that don't fit into those clean three boxes of president, Congress, and judiciary, and then kind of leave it at that. Congress is always trying to be creative to delegate, but behind the scenes really keep control. But I don't think the founders wanted to allow that kind of experimentation. That this separation of powers does impose this kind of straitjacket. And I thought this would appeal to George, because I know George is also very worried about just growing federal power and the reduction in our individual rights. Forcing this kind of clean formalist approach to separation of powers makes it harder for government to work, right? If you think about what the independent agencies are, they're just like a clever compromise to get, and this is the way Wilson described it, as a way to get around the separation of powers, a way to get around federalism, the straitjacket of the Constitution on, progressive government, our reaching for utopia through good government. And if you think about it, the Constitution actually creates a lot of costs on the government to prevent them from being cooperative, being experimental. And so I think that would be a good example of that Congress would be forced to take the decision back, fit some kind of new agency into this Spartan three-branch approach to the separation of powers, no creativity in creating new features like the Federal Reserve Bank or the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And that has the effect of preserving our liberty. Because that was the other Madisonian point I was going to mention, is what's the point of all the fighting, the friction, the contest between the branches? It's actually to have inefficient government so that our liberties are protected by the absence of federal power.
Yes, I quite agree that the framers did not set out to make an efficient government. The idea would have horrified them. They wanted a safe government, safe enough to secure the one word most neglected in the Declaration of Independence. Governments are created to secure our rights, not to give us our rights, which precede government. So John mentions the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau sort of goes against my argument here, because as originally passed, it's the most audaciously unconstitutional thing Congress has done in many a moon. I mean, it's funded by the Federal Reserve Board, which gets in one case, gets a sheet of paper with a request saying, give us $90 billion, and they do. And whatever, I mean, John and I can certainly agree that whoever should run the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Reserve shouldn't do it. So, but let's go. Again, I want to know, to what extent should the Supreme Court, when ruling as it did in overturning Humphrey's executor, to what extent is it proper for the Supreme Court to look at the context of modern government and say the consequences of this in an era of rampant presidential power and in an era of Congress enjoying rampant presidential power, to what extent should the court consider the broad contour consequences of what it says in shaping the relations between the executive and the legislature?
Yeah, I was going to ask you almost the same thing, George, from your presentation, is because I read your comments as saying that we're all good originalists, but originalists should still take into account the consequences. And I know you would never want to be associated with this, but that sounds like Breyerism to me. That's Justice Breyer's great response to Scalia was originalism doesn't work. You have to take the consequences into account. And then he would say, in reality, you are, even when you're doing originalism, taking consequences account. And then I think Justice Scalia would say something like, I'm an originalist, but I'm not a nut. And then we often forget the rest of that sentence because I think the original sentence was, I am an originalist, but I'm not a nut like Justice Thomas. And they usually drop that part out. But I think you could say you could be a strict originalist and say, devil may care about the consequences, right? That's the structure the founders set up. And that was the original understanding. And if the consequences turn out to be bad for the country, we have to correct it through constitutional amendment. You hear the Democratic Socialists of America making that kind of claim, right? They are saying the Senate is a terrible thing for the country and we should change it. There are people, you raised the Electoral College, which I think we can both agree doesn't work anything like the original understanding. And yet we stick to it. And it may lead to bad outcomes. The jury's still out. I tend to think it leads to slightly better outcomes than worse, but it doesn't really reflect the people's views directly. It's sort of mediated a little bit by the states, and that only comes out really when you have a closely divided country, a closely divided election. But you have these forces on the progressive left trying to get around the Electoral College through this compact between the states. But it seems to me that the Constitution is allowed to have bad consequences, and that I think it's asking too much of the court to try to fix them because it can make a serious mistake. I throw out an example I disagree with terribly and an example I agree with, but when the court tries to do that, when it tries to settle national problems, it often makes things worse. Dred Scott is the most famous example where Chief Justice Thomas said, I'm going to settle the slavery question, tearing the country apart. I do think that Chief Justice Roberts just tried to do that in the birthright citizenship case, where he's saying, I'm going to settle this citizenship issue and it won't tear the country apart anymore. I tend to agree that Roberts is right on the merits, but I don't think he's necessarily right in how he's using the court's power. So even if we're going to take consequences into account, I'm not sure we should, but I don't think it should be the courts that should do it. In fact, I think that it should be the president and Congress through their fighting that set up these new arrangements. And I guess I would ask George, says, what if you don't agree with the unitary executive theory, what are the limits that you would place on how far the president and the Congress can go in creating innovations, creativity, right? How much would you allow them to move beyond the sort of strict, simple separation of powers that the founders created, that Madison created?
Well, certainly the setting of limits would be the judicial responsibility, because the judicial response, if the judges don't do it, no one will. Because again, in the language of Madisonian incentives, the incentives are all for the president to hoard power and all for Congress to give the president power to hoard. I guess I would be, to continue with Scalia's vocabulary, a faint-hearted originalist if an originalist is supposed to say there's a pretty clear distinction between legislative and executive power. And when there's a gray area question, we're going to settle all these disputes in the president's favor. In 60 or so years of thinking about this stuff, there's been one great change of mind on my part, and that is I originally was a believer with my good friend Bob Bork in a kind of plebiscitary approach to the Constitution. He was a Holmesian at heart, I think, and when Holmes said, American people want to go to hell, I will help them, it's my job. I finally got off that bandwagon when I think conservatism was ill-served for decades when, driven slightly mad, understandably so, by the Warren Court, they said, we're against judicial activism. Conservatives of my now stripe have changed the vocabulary a bit defensively to say we're not for activism or for judicial engagement as a more sanitary way of embracing judicial power. But if the court will not referee this gravely unequal battle between the Congress and the president, unequal because Congress is on the president's side in this alleged fight between Congress and the president, no one will. It just won't happen. As Justice Gorsuch has repeatedly said, there's a one-way ratchet working here. Once Congress gives the power to the president is not going to give it back voluntarily, and they're not going to take it back because the president can veto measures to take it back. And supermajorities to overturn presidential vetoes are passingly rare these days. So I guess what I'm saying is I accept the logic of my position, which is I could be stigmatized as an imperial judiciary. I think an imperial judiciary is called for right now.
Let me ask additional question if I could. I think the two hardest cases, one for me and one for you. I think for me, the hardest case is the Federal Reserve, because if there's one place where I think all social science seems to agree, it is don't let elected politicians control interest rates. There's a great study by a Yale economist named Tufte, who eventually became Mr. PowerPoint. Before he was Mr. PowerPoint, he did a great book that showed exactly how the Federal Reserve, even though it's independent, would often lower interest rates right before elections because they had an interest in keeping all politicians happy. But think about how bad it would be if the Federal Reserve were directly controlled by a president. That's a very hard case for my side. I think the hard case for you is foreign policy, because that is a decision that's made almost immediately after the founding. President Washington has to decide whether we're going to live up to the French U.S. Treaty of Alliance and help the French in the French Revolution. Are we going to recognize French ambassadors sent by the new French revolutionary government? And Jefferson and Madison accuse Washington of being some kind of monarchist by claiming he has the right to control foreign policy. Washington sides with Hamilton. And I think our country has lived under this view ever since, which is presidents control foreign policy, not Congress. Hamilton didn't make the efficiency arguments that, say, Kissinger would make, right? Kissinger famously said, we don't have 535 secretaries of state. Hamilton just says instead, the executive powers granted to the president under the what we would call the Anglo-American legal tradition, executive power that has always been understood to include the power of controlling relations with other countries. And Hamilton said, unless the Constitution specifically takes it away from the president, like the power over tariffs and so on, we still carry that inference into our own Constitution. If you're worried about consequences, I would think this would be one where you really wouldn't want, right, to reject the unitary executive theory. You don't want foreign policy controlled, despite Madison and Jefferson's view. You don't want Congress controlling foreign policy. It makes no sense. but it's also that's consistent with the unitary executive theory of originalism theory of unitary executive. So how do you come out on those two examples?
Well, I think it's going to be frankly hilarious watching the Supreme Court try and carve out an exemption for the Federal Reserve Board, because as you say, it's as a matter of consequences, it's very important that it carve it out, but carving it out's not going to be easy. With regard to foreign policy, my predilections have least momentum for respect in this field. I grant that. I would point out, however, that I was working in the Senate when the Senate, using the power of the purse, ended the war in Vietnam, effectively ended it. So it's not that the president, although vastly supreme in the field of foreign, he's still not all-powerful.
Yes.
And the technology of communications and of weaponry and all has uniformly worked to strengthen the case for presidential supremacy. I take that. But again, we're all living with the consequences of Teddy Roosevelt's discovery of what he called the stewardship concept of the presidency, which is, said Roosevelt, I have the power, and he did this, I think, in connection with an anthracite coal strike that would have been disastrous for the country. Teddy Roosevelt said, I have the power, the president has the power to do whatever he's not explicitly forbidden to do. Well, no, not quite. And again, there are tiers of deference here. There's foreign policy is at one end and domestic policy is at another. And you're right. I mean, we're never going to get a kind of tidiness here. And I think what the executive, the unitary theory of the executive wants is a tidiness that is simply incompatible with the way the American people have made clear they want governed. They want something like an administrative state. They want a very large regulatory government. Well, that incorporates a kind of ethic of common provision that they have embraced through what we used to call the welfare state and we now call the entitlement state. But the search for more perfect tidiness leads us into presidentialism, because all these disputes get settled in the president's favor. And again, the Gorsuch's ratchet clicks in, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So I'm back to the imperial judiciary, the engaged judiciary, trying to referee these things, beginning with Chevron, continuing with the major questions doctrine. And let us hope, reaching a kind of happy culmination in a really revived non-delegation doctrine, wherein the justices simply say, John Locke got it right. Legislators can create laws, they can't create other legislators.
I would just add one thing there, and I don't know if you agree with this, George, but if you do have the courts go this far and try to restore power to Congress, and if Congress doesn't want to do it, where they politically, the incentive is against them taking any candy away from any baby's mouth, right? So then and I don't think the courts have the institutional size or power to really correct for the administrative state. And it's still going to be up to a president to do it. I mean, the president is Trump is brash, Trump is unsophisticated, Trump is narcissistic, and so on and so forth. But one thing he seems to be doing, because he's acting through the Office of Management, but he seems to be taking a hammer to the administrative state. And he is using these powers, unitary executive power, to try to do it. And if the real blemish on the Constitution, the real big barnacle on the boat that the founders did not put there is the administrative state, then why can't we be in favor of a president using these powers to try to cut it down to size as best he can, given that Congress isn't going to do it, given that the courts, they're just too small. They can only do it case by case. They can't really end the administration, just like they didn't create it. The courts didn't create the administrative state. They allowed it. They tried to stop it, and they gave up when FDR threatened to destroy the independence of the Supreme Court. But in the absence of the judiciary having the real power to really reverse this gigantic government, Congress not wanting to do it, then it is up to the president. I don't want to be read, because I think the progressives used to think this way. They thought the presidency was the way to overcome all social problems. For example, once upon a time, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was in favor of the president going to war without congressional authority because of nuclear weapons. The great progressives of the 50s and 60s wanted the president to overcome the South, right? That was sort of why that's when the progressives really fell in love with the presidency. So I don't want to say the president is just sort of the vessel we put all our hopes into, but it's more like in the absence of the other branches really being able to correct the administrative state. I think it leaves it to the president to do. And the only tool he really has is the removal power created or recognized by the unitary executive theory. I don't see what other solution there's left.
Well, the solution, and it's a pretty thin reed to lean on, is something like judicial activism regarding the non-delegation doctrine. But the problem is it ought to be rooted in a democracy or a republic is the sainted American people. The American people don't care about any of this. They praise the Constitution more fervently and carefully than they read it. And the idea that the American people are going to insist on a kind of propriety is fanciful. Here I mount one of my many hobby horses that are in the long list of lost causes, and that is term limits. What legislative term limits would do in Congress, it would change, again, Madisonian language, it would change the incentives for entering public life and for making decisions while in public life. Look at three senators right now. Senator Tillis of North Carolina, Cassidy of Louisiana, and Cornyn of Texas. Suddenly, they're really interesting. Why? Because they're leaving Congress, and they're showing little faint flickerings of senatorial behavior, the way the founders assumed falsely that senators would be: independent, rivalrous, prickly about their branch of government. It's fun to watch three senators becoming senatorial almost too late.
The Holy Ghost might appear all of a sudden.
Yeah, one question I would like to offer, and that is understanding that we have the Constitution with the separation of powers. When you're talking about the weakness of Congress and the difficulty of the courts policing all of this and the rise of presidentialism, isn't the answer parliamentarism? Eliminating the separation of the executive and the legislative, and instead emulating an Australian system with a parliamentary form of government, a bicameral legislature, but still an independent Supreme Court to police the excesses of the unified government.
Well, that's too close to surrender and despair. David, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's mandatory. I think there have been waves in American history, and I'm going to dispute a little bit here Gorsuch's ratchet. He's right about how his ratchet works in Washington and in the maneuvering between the branches. But the American people are getting a close-up look at a rampant president right now, and I think they're having second thoughts as to, gee whiz, can he really do all this stuff? Can he build that arch to diminish both the Lincoln Memorial at one end of the bridge and Arlington Cemetery at the other? And I think the American people are having some thoughts. And I don't think it's impossible that someone's going to come along and say, I'm going to run for president, and if I'm elected, you're going to go weeks at a time and forget I'm there. I'm just not going to be in your face. I'm not going to be commenting whenever a pop musician dies in a plane crash. This is not what I'm going to be, a receding presidential presence. So it's possible, this may be just another one of my delusions, it's possible that there will be a political correction here in the direction of a style of presidency that will be much more, that will translate into institutional adjustments.
Well, far be it for me to say George is delusional, because actually there's a case, Calvin Coolidge.
Yes.
There's an example of exactly what you're talking about, that Wilson, I mean, the great mastermind of this, Woodrow Wilson did what he wanted to do under the cover of World War I. The government expanded massively under World War I, not just to wage the war effort, but there were, people forget, committees on censoring, right? Publications, and right, huge an administrative state was built up under World War I. I think the progressives hoped it was going to be permanent. They actually thought their model for progressive government was, they thought mobilized war government was great, and we should just make it permanent. Calvin Coolidge came in. Harding came in first, but Coolidge came in, and it's amazing how fast that got reversed and how quickly Coolidge did restore the system close to, and the Republicans in Congress, closer to the founders' vision. So I would just say it's not impossible. It has happened before. In fact, I would have said before the Cold War government, our system did sort of expand and retract quickly. And yes, during crisis, Jefferson expanded the government enormously to try to enforce his embargo acts. And then the government shrunk quickly thereafter. So I think it is possible for, under our system, particularly in domestic area, to be able to do that. And then the second thing in response to Henry's point is, and I'm not sure what George thinks, it's actually, I think a kind of parliamentary system is the problem. That's what the progressives wanted to recreate. That's what Wilson thought he was doing. George mentioned political parties. Wilson, recall, he said what he wanted to create in the United States was a parliamentary system of government, using political parties to eliminate the gap between the presidency and Congress. And so to me, the problem is that we are already too close to parliamentary governance. And that's creating all the problems, is because look at the British. I mean, I love this show. Yes, I know Henry loves this show too. Yes, Minister and Yes, Prime Minister. That's kind of like the progressive theory of government. And that's what you would have with independent agencies running rampant, is that kind of British parliamentary system with a thin layer of no separation of powers, but the real power held by the unelected bureaucrats right underneath the Sir Humphreys, really running everything just beneath them, really independent from political. I think that's where parliamentary government gets you.
A fascinating discussion. It reminds me of how revolutionary it was when Richard Nixon appeared on the #1 television program in America, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, to say "sock it to me" in 1968. Hubert Humphrey,
did he really?
Yes, he did. You can find it. You can find it on the YouTube if you want to see. He actually does a good job acting with the facial expression. But Hubert Humphrey declined the invitation to do something similar, saying it was beneath the dignity of the presidency. So I hear George, and I'm thinking we need to go. We need to go back to where appearing and saying "sock it to me" is beneath the dignity of the American presidency. But far be it from me to continue a discourse on American popular entertainment and its intersection with American politics, which seems to be quite intersected these days. We are at concluding statement time, and in inverse order, that means that George has 2 minutes to offer his thoughts, and then we will end with Sean. George, you're up.
Well, I guess continuing to allow my wishes to be the father of my thoughts, perhaps the solution, if there is anything like a solution to the imbalance that has been created in American constitutional architecture, it will be that the aesthetic will trump the political. That is, that the American people will look at the presidency and say, this is embarrassing. This is not healthy to have a system revolving entirely around the son of the presidency. And I think that it is possible that someone is going to come along and say, well, I'm going to offer something new. You know, when Kennedy came along and said, I'm young, and Eisenhower, I'm going to replace, wasn't. When Jimmy Carter came along and said, I'm not a lawyer and I'll never lie to you because I'm going to replace Richard Nixon, who died, there is a crude but effective dialectic in American politics. And I have confidence in it only because I have confidence in nothing else at this point.
Thank you, George. John, the last word is yours.
I think it's telling how far our discussion strayed from the text and structure of the original Constitution, because I do think that those best read do stand for the idea that the founders, through Article 2, gave the president all the executive power that the federal government was to have, and that executive power included the right to fire all subordinate officials so that the presidency was unified, and that this was necessary to allow the president to carry out his constitutional roles, enforcing the law, protecting the nation's security. George's, I take it, his main criticism of that is that does not take into account the modern political circumstances where we are living in a period of presidential supremacy. His answer is to increase the powers of the other branches to match the presidency. An imperial judiciary, he mentioned a few times, restoring Congress's powers through preventing it from giving their powers away, as it were. I understand the attraction of that. That is the idea that also was present at the founding, the idea of checks and balances, which is never really in the Constitution directly, but you see its echoes here and there. For example, splitting up some of the executive powers like nominations, ratifying treaties. The thing I worry about is how do we know what the exact right balance was? I think even the founders, like Madison, weren't sure about that. So they expected the branches to fight each other in a kind of self-correcting mechanism. I think it expects too much from our judiciary to have them rebalance constantly. That reeks too much of Justice Kennedy, Justice O'Connor, Justice Powell's totality of circumstances, balancing everything and sort of saying, I know it when I see it. I know the balance is right now because I see the balance, but I can't give you a principle that would govern in the future. That could, in the end, I worry, be more damaging to our constitutional system than the founders' original design.
Thank you, John. Thank you, George. And thank you, listeners. Take care.